Germany in the winter of 1932–33 was not merely poor. It was a country that had already experienced economic death twice in a single lifetime. The first time came in 1923, when hyperinflation devoured the currency so completely that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks one day and 800 billion the next. People carried wages home in wheelbarrows. Grandmothers burned bundles of banknotes in stoves because paper was cheaper than coal. Lifetime savings accounts, decades of careful thrift, were wiped out in weeks. The middle class learned a lesson that scarred the national psyche forever. Money can vanish overnight, and no promise printed on it is sacred. The second death arrived in 1929, when the American stock market collapsed and the loans that had kept Germany breathing since 1924 were called in with brutal speed. Factories that had only just reopened shut again. By the winter of 1932, 6 million Germans, 1 worker in 3, were officially unemployed, and the real number was far higher. Men in threadbare suits stood in bread lines beside former bankers and engineers. Children grew up pale and rachitic. Suicide rates soared. The streets of Berlin, Leipzig, and Hamburg filled with the hopeless shuffle of people who had lost faith not only in the Weimar Republic, but in the very idea of stability itself. This was the psychological ground on which Adolf Hitler walked into power on January 30, 1933. He did not need to promise paradise. He only needed to promise an end to humiliation, and the exhausted nation was ready to believe almost anything that sounded like strength. Within weeks of taking office, Hitler gathered his cabinet and the heads of the armed forces in the dimly lit chancellery and delivered an order that sounded like pure delusion. He wanted a modern, mechanized, first-class fighting force, army, navy, and air force, built in total secrecy and at impossible speed. The Treaty of Versailles, he declared, was no longer worth the paper it was written on. Germany would rearm completely, immediately, and without regard to cost. The room was silent, not because the men around the table doubted the morality of breaking the treaty, but because every general, admiral, and finance official present knew the treasury was empty. Germany's gold and foreign exchange reserves in early 1933 amounted to less than 100 million Reichsmarks, barely enough to keep the government running for 2 weeks, let alone buy the steel, aluminum, rubber, and oil needed for a modern war. Hans Luther, president of the Reichsbank, spoke the truth aloud. Mein Führer, we cannot even import the coal to keep the lights on in Berlin, much less the raw materials for guns and aircraft. We are bankrupt. Hitler did not argue. He simply stared until Luther looked away. Then he turned to the one man in the room who had not flinched. Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was already a legend in international finance. In 1923–24, when the mark had become worthless, he had performed what looked like a miracle. He invented an entirely new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by gold, but by a fictional mortgage on all the land and industry of Germany. 1 Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old paper marks, and astonishingly, people believed in it. Prices stabilized almost overnight. Schacht had proven that under the right conditions of desperation and authority, belief itself can function as money. Hitler now wanted that miracle repeated on a far grander and far more dangerous scale. Schacht accepted the post of Reichsbank president a second time in March 1933. His real power, however, came a year later when he was also named Minister of Economics. From that moment, the fate of Germany's rearmament rested in the hands of a conservative, monocle-wearing financier who despised most of the Nazi Party's thugs, but who was willing to harness their energy for his own vision of national revival. Schacht understood something that neither Hitler nor the generals fully grasped. You do not need gold if you can create trust, and you do not need trust if you can create fear. In the spring and summer of 1933, Schacht began a series of secret meetings with the titans of German industry, Gustav Krupp, von Bohlen und Halbach, Fritz Thyssen, the directors of IG Farben, Siemens, Rheinmetall, and dozens of others. These men had watched their factories stand idle since 1929. Their order books were empty, their workers dismissed, their share prices in the gutter. Schacht offered them something irresistible: massive state contracts, guaranteed profits, and the chance to rebuild their empires. There was only one problem: the state had no money to pay them. Schacht's answer was as simple as it was audacious. Then we will pay you with money we do not yet have, he said. The room leaned forward. For the first time in years, the industrialists smelled opportunity. Across Germany, factory gates that had been chained shut for half a decade began to open again. Unemployed men streamed in at dawn, their faces still carrying the hollow look of the Depression, but now lit with something new: purpose, pride, the feeling of being needed. Smokestacks that had stood cold began to breathe fire into the night sky. The Autobahns, sold to the public as public works projects, were designed from the beginning with military logistics in mind: wide lanes, gentle curves, and reinforced bridges that could carry the weight of tanks. Everything was moving again. Unemployment fell by 2 million in 1933, then by another 2 million in 1934. To the outside world, it looked like an economic miracle. But miracles have machinery, and this one ran on shadow and deception. While the surface of Germany filled with parades, smiling workers, and propaganda films of happy families, an entirely parallel financial system was being constructed in back rooms and locked vaults. Taxes could not pay for rearmament because taxes are slow and visible. Foreign loans were impossible because Germany had defaulted on everything in 1931, and no one would lend another pfennig. The only option left was to invent money that no one could see. Money that existed only on ledgers. Money that could be spent today and, if everything went according to plan, repaid never. By the end of 1933, the first disguised tanks were rolling out of barns labeled agricultural machinery. Luftwaffe pilots were secretly training in civilian flying clubs and on postal routes over the Soviet Union. Submarine parts were being manufactured in sections by companies that officially made boilers and turbines. The Wehrmacht, limited by treaty to 100,000 long-service professionals, was quietly drafting hundreds of thousands of young men into labor service camps that were military training in all but name. None of this was paid for with real money that existed in the real world. It was paid for with promises, with signatures, with carefully designed illusions printed on thick, official-looking paper. The world saw full employment and gleaming new roads. It did not see the cold metallic ring of empty vaults echoing beneath the Reichsbank. It did not hear the quiet rustle of financial documents being prepared that would one day bring the entire structure crashing down. Germany was broke, but it was about to create wealth that existed only on paper. Hjalmar Schacht never raised his voice. He did not need to. In the spring of 1934, he sat alone in his office on the Jägerstrasse, monocle glinting under the green banker's lamp, and drew the blueprint for one of the most audacious financial deceptions in history. The Reich had to spend roughly 1 billion Reichsmarks a year on rearmament, yet the entire national budget was only 5 billion, most of it already committed to food imports and debt service. There was no room, no gold, no foreign credit, and no time. Schacht's solution was not to find money, it was to abolish the need for money as the world understood it. He began with a shell company. On July 20, 1933, 4 trusted industrialists, Krupp's representative among them, quietly registered a firm called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, Mefo for short. On paper, Mefo was a private enterprise that studied new methods of steel production. In reality, it had no factories, no laboratories, no employees beyond a postal address and a safe. It existed for one purpose only, to print money that was not called money. Here's how the trick worked. When Krupp, Rheinmetall, or Siemens received a secret armament contract from the Reich, they did not receive cash from the treasury. Instead, they were paid with Mefo bills, 5-year promissory notes issued by the fake company. These bills promised to pay the bearer a fixed sum plus 4% interest on a specified future date. Crucially, the bills were signed not by the Reich Finance Ministry but by the phantom Mefo Corporation, and they carried the personal guarantee of the Reichsbank itself. Any bank in Germany was legally permitted to discount cash in a Mefo bill at the Reichsbank at any time, receiving real Reichsmarks in exchange. In practice, this made Mefo bills as good as cash. Better even, because they paid interest and were accepted everywhere. Industrialists loved them. A steelmaker could take a Mefo bill worth 10 million marks to his local bank on Monday, walk out with 10 million real marks the same afternoon, and immediately buy nickel from Sweden or rubber from Malaya. The bank, in turn, could either hold the bill until maturity, collecting the juicy 4%, or quietly hand it back to the Reichsbank whenever it needed liquidity. The Reichsbank simply printed the necessary marks and added the bill to a secret ledger. No foreign creditor could see it. No parliamentary committee could question it. No Versailles inspector could trace it. The spending was off the books, off the budget, and most importantly, off the conscience of the world. By 1938, Mefo bills in circulation reached 12 billion Reichsmarks, more than twice the entire official national debt Germany admitted to having. Schacht called it a breathing lung for the economy. In private, he was blunter. It was a temporary bridge over an abyss. He knew the bills would eventually have to be redeemed, but he calculated that if rearmament restored full employment and frightened the world into concessions, new tax revenues and territorial gains would materialize to close the gap. It was the same logic a gambler uses at the roulette table. One more spin, one more victory, and the losses will be covered. The system required absolute complicity. Banks were instructed never to refuse a Mefo bill. Factory managers were told that anyone who asked awkward questions about payment would lose future contracts. Workers on the shop floor never saw the paper at all. They simply noticed that the gates stayed open, the whistles blew, and their pay packets were thick again. The middle class, still haunted by memories of wheelbarrows, watched their savings accounts slowly refill with ordinary Reichsmarks and convinced themselves the nightmare was over. They did not understand that those Reichsmarks had been conjured into existence by the stroke of a pen in a locked room. By the autumn of 1935, the illusion was performing perfectly. Unemployment had fallen below 1 million. The Autobahn stretched across the landscape like concrete arteries. In the Harz Mountains, underground factories the size of small towns were already being excavated. In Dessau, Junkers was assembling Ju-86 bombers, disguised as mail planes. In Friedrichshafen, Zeppelin sheds that had once built airships for tourists now echoed with the riveting of Dornier flying boats. And still, the world saw almost nothing. British and French intelligence noted the new roads and the falling unemployment figures, but they filed reports that spoke of economic recovery rather than rearmament. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel congratulated Schacht on his prudent management. The Times of London called him the wizard who pulled Germany out of the slump. Schacht accepted the praise with thin, ironic smiles. He knew how fragile the magic was. Every tank that rolled off the line at Alket, every 88mm barrel forged at Krupp, every liter of synthetic aviation fuel distilled at Luna pushed the ledger deeper into the red. Raw materials had to be imported, and imports had to be paid for in scarce foreign currency. To solve that problem, Schacht invented another layer of deception: bilateral clearing agreements. Germany would sell coal or machinery to Brazil, Argentina, or Romania, but instead of receiving dollars or pounds, it received promises of soy, oil, or wheat that were deposited in frozen accounts. Those promises were then used to buy tungsten from Portugal or chromium from Turkey. The world's trade statistics recorded brisk German exports. They did not record that half the transactions were barter and the other half paid for with Mefo paper that would never be honored. By 1936, the strain was beginning to show, but only to those who knew where to look. The Reichsbank's gold and foreign exchange reserves, already microscopic in 1933, had fallen to almost zero. Imports of iron ore were running at triple the 1932 level, yet exports, Germany's only real source of hard currency, were stagnating. Schacht began issuing private warnings. In a memorandum marked "strictly confidential," he told Hitler that the economy was driving at 70 miles an hour toward a brick wall. The Führer read it, underlined the word wall 3 times, and wrote in the margin, "Then we shall smash through the wall." Schacht tried again in 1937, this time in front of Goering, who had been given sweeping new powers over the economy. He laid out the numbers: 12 billion in Mefo bills, another 7 billion in short-term treasury certificates, raw material stocks sufficient for only 6 months of intensified rearmament. Goering laughed. "Paper is paper, Herr Doctor. If we run out, we print more." Schacht replied icily, "There are limits even to what paper can do, Herr Reichsmarschall." Goering's smile vanished. From that moment, Schacht's days were numbered. Yet even as his influence waned, the machine he had built kept accelerating. Industrialists no longer needed his signature. They had learned the trick themselves. The army, the navy, the Luftwaffe, and now the SS all placed orders directly with factories, paying with whatever scrap of paper the recipient would accept. The Reichsbank became little more than a giant photocopier, churning out marks to honor the endless stream of bills flowing back to its counters. The printing presses ran so hot that the ink sometimes smudged. Germany was no longer spending money, it was spending the future. And the future, for the moment, believed. By the summer of 1936, the illusion had grown into something larger than any single man, even its creator. It was no longer a financial trick, it had become a parallel universe running alongside the real one, perfectly synchronized, perfectly invisible. On the surface, Germany looked like a normal country again. Shop windows full, cafes crowded, children in crisp uniforms saluting flags, radios playing cheerful marches. Underneath, an entirely different nation was being born, one built on paper, promises, and the willingness of millions to pretend they did not notice the cracks. The Mefo system had evolved into a living organism. 12 billion Reichsmarks in bills were now circulating, but they were only the visible tip. Beneath them lay an iceberg of secondary and tertiary paper. Work creation bills, tax remission certificates, special bills issued by the Labor Front, delivery certificates from the armed forces, even vouchers redeemable in cigarettes or butter at factory canteens. Every institution that needed to spend money without admitting it had learned to print its own scrip, always with the same magical clause, redeemable at the Reichsbank on demand. The Reichsbank never refused. It simply created the marks and recorded the debt in ledgers that no foreign auditor was ever allowed to see. Industry complied with breathtaking enthusiasm. The great cartels, Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, Rheinmetall, had discovered that rearmament was the most profitable business in German history. Profit margins on tanks and submarines were fixed by the Reich at 6 to 10%, but the real money was made in the shadows. A company could accept Mefo bills for a battleship turret, discount them immediately for cash, then use the cash to buy raw materials on credit from another firm that was itself being paid in Mefo paper. The same 10 million marks could finance 3 or 4 transactions before anyone asked where the metal was actually coming from. The industrialists understood the game perfectly. As long as the music kept playing, everyone got rich. Workers, too, became willing accomplices. The average metal worker in Essen or Hamburg earned 50 to 60 Reichsmarks a week in 1937. Modest by 1928 standards, but a fortune compared to the zero of 1932. Overtime was compulsory, holidays were canceled, and the factories never cooled. Men who had once feared starvation now feared only that the orders might stop coming. When a foreman whispered that the new tractor parts they were riveting were actually Panzer III hulls, the men nodded and worked faster. Patriotism, fear of unemployment, and the simple animal joy of having purpose again fused into a single, powerful drug. No one wanted to be the first to ask what would happen when the bills came due. The deception extended to the very statistics Germany published. Official budgets showed military spending at 8 to 10% of national income, perfectly respectable, almost modest. In reality, it was closer to 60% by 1938. The difference was hidden through a labyrinth of special accounts. Donations, from the Adolf Hitler Spende der Deutschen Wirtschaft, a slush fund fed by compulsory corporate contributions, and outright falsification. When the League of Nations asked for clarification, the reply came back wrapped in bureaucratic politeness and printed on paper, so much paper that the question drowned in it. Abroad, the world remained astonishingly blind. British businessmen returned from Berlin praising German efficiency. French intelligence produced reports that were laughed out of the Quai d'Orsay because they sounded too alarmist. American journalists wrote about the Nazi miracle and compared Schacht favorably to Roosevelt. Only a handful of people, exiled German economists like Wilhelm Lautenbach in London, or the lonely Swiss analyst at the Bank for International Settlements who noticed that Germany's reported gold reserves never changed, understood that something surreal was happening. Their warnings were filed and forgotten. Inside Germany, the pressure was becoming physical. raw materials were the choke point. There simply was not enough iron ore, nickel, tungsten, rubber, or oil in the entire Reich to sustain production at the pace Hitler demanded. Schacht's bilateral barter deals helped, but they were clumsy and slow. By late 1937, the Reichswerke Hermann Göring, a state-owned industrial conglomerate created specifically to bypass private cartels, was seizing mines inside Germany and planning to seize more outside it. Göring himself, now plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, issued orders that read like military communiques. The production of synthetic rubber must increase by 400%. Failure is unacceptable. Chemists at IG Farben worked 90-hour weeks in laboratories that stank of benzene and fear. The first real tremor came in the spring of 1938. Several large Mefo bills matured simultaneously, and the holders, mostly savings banks and insurance companies, decided to cash them rather than roll them over. The Reichsbank had to print 1.5 billion marks in a single month to meet the demand. Prices in the black market jumped. Butter disappeared from shops for 3 weeks. Schacht rushed to Hitler with a new memorandum. The economy was overheating, inflation was stirring, and the foreign exchange would be exhausted within months. Hitler's response was to accelerate. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops marched into Austria. The Anschluss was not merely a political triumph, it was an economic rescue operation. Within days, Reichsbank officials were flown to Vienna with suitcases of freshly printed Reichsmarks. They seized the Austrian National Bank's gold, 78 tons, worth almost 800 million Reichsmarks, and shipped it to Berlin. Austrian Jews were systematically robbed of businesses, apartments, and savings accounts. The sudden influx bought 6 more months of raw material imports. German newspapers celebrated the homecoming of the Ostmark. German accountants celebrated the sudden surplus in the secret ledgers. Schacht watched the looting with cold disgust. He had built the machine to restore German power, not to finance gangsterism. In November 1938, he submitted his resignation, citing irreconcilable differences over economic policy. Hitler accepted it with relief. Göring took over full control. The magician had been dismissed. The juggernaut he created rolled on without him. By the beginning of 1939, the numbers were no longer possible to hide, even from the German people. Food rationing was introduced in August, officially, to guarantee fair distribution. In reality, because imports had collapsed. The black market exploded. A pound of butter cost 15 Reichsmarks if you could find it. Workers began hoarding tools and scrap metal against the day the factories might close again. In the Reichsbank vaults, the last scraps of gold were counted and recounted like the beads of a rosary. The machine had only one fuel left: expansion. The illusion had grown too large for Germany to contain. 12 billion in Mefo bills, 19 billion in total hidden debt, an industrial plant running at 120% capacity, a population fed on promises and propaganda, and a military that now numbered 4 million men under arms. All of it balanced on a single, terrible necessity. The next country had to be taken before the creditors came knocking. But illusions have deadlines, and Germany's deadline was 1939. In March 1939, the last pretense ended. The machine that Schacht had built to buy time had run out of it. The Mefo bills were maturing faster than new ones could be printed. Foreign exchange reserves were measured in weeks, not months at most. The Reichsbank's secret ledgers showed a hidden debt of more than 21 billion Reichsmarks, an amount larger than the entire visible national income. The factories were devouring raw materials at a rate that could not be sustained by barter, smuggling, or synthetic substitutes. The only remaining asset Germany possessed was the threat of its own army. On the 15th of March 1939, German troops crossed into what remained of Czechoslovakia. There was no declaration of war, no ultimatum, only an invitation issued at gunpoint. Within 48 hours, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was proclaimed, and the looting began with bureaucratic precision. The Czech National Bank in Prague handed over 380 million Reichsmarks in gold and foreign currency. The Škoda works at Plzeň, one of the largest arms manufacturers in Europe, was simply renamed Reichswerke Hermann Göring and ordered to triple production of tanks and artillery. Czech workers had been building for their own army. By the end of April, the Reich had stripped Czechoslovakia of resources worth almost 4 billion Reichsmarks, enough to keep the rearmament engine turning for another half year. The pattern was now set. Conquest had become the only functioning branch of the German economy. Every annexation was planned with accountants riding in the staff cars behind the panzers. Their briefcases contained not battle plans but lists: gold reserves, steel output, railway rolling stock, foreign currency accounts, Jewish-owned businesses to be Aryanized, forced labor quotas. War was no longer a political risk. It was an emergency refinancing operation. Poland was next. In the last week of August 1939, the Reichsbank calculated that the absolute limit of solvency would be reached in October. On the 1st of September, the Wehrmacht attacked. The campaign lasted barely 4 weeks, but the economic harvest was colossal. Poland's central bank in Warsaw surrendered gold worth 280 million Reichsmarks. The Upper Silesian coal and steel basin, annexed outright, added production capacity equal to 15% of the pre-war Reich. Hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians were deported to Germany as slave laborers, freeing German men for the front and keeping wages artificially low, wages even lower. The plunder bought another year. The system was now naked. Goering no longer bothered with euphemisms. In an October 1939 speech to Gauleiters and industrialists, he declared openly, "We must export or die. If we cannot export, we must take. The war will feed itself." The phrase became internal policy. Every occupied territory was assigned an exploitation quota expressed in calories, tons of steel, and human bodies. Denmark delivered butter, Norway nickel, France bauxite and wine, the Netherlands dairy and vegetables. Trains that rolled west in the morning returned east at night, loaded with coal, ore, and cattle. Europe was being turned into a single giant supply depot for the German war machine. Back home, the population felt the change in their bones. Ration cards that had once allowed a tolerable diet were cut again and again. By 1941, the official meat ration was 250 grams per week, less than a single hamburger patty today, and even that was rarely available. Soap, leather, textiles, coffee disappeared entirely from legal shops. Workers who had cheered the return of full employment in 1936 now worked 72-hour weeks under air raid drills and received pay packets whose purchasing power shrank visibly from month to month. Yet the factories kept expanding. New underground plants in the Harz and Thuringia were designed to be bomb-proof. Their construction devoured concrete and steel that should have gone to civilian housing. The machine no longer served the nation. The nation existed only to feed the machine. The greatest irony belonged to the original Mefo bills. By 1940, most had reached maturity. The Reich simply refused to honor them. Banks and insurance companies that had accepted the paper in good faith were told that redemption would occur after the final victory. Some institutions tried to protest. Their directors were replaced overnight by party loyalists. The 12 billion Reichsmarks in phantom money became permanent inflation, waiting to be born. The Reichsbank stopped publishing meaningful balance sheets. Money, as Germans had once understood it, had ceased to exist. In the occupied territories, the process was even more brutal. In France, after the 1940 armistice, the Reich-imposed exchange rate was set at 20 francs to 1 Reichsmark, an intentional overvaluation of 300%. Every French worker's labor, every bottle of Bordeaux, every ton of Lorraine iron ore was purchased at 1/4 its real value. The French economy was bled of an estimated 600 billion Reichsmarks over 4 years. The proceeds were immediately spent on U-boats, V-2 rockets, and synthetic oil plants. When French reserves ran dry, the Reich began printing Reichskreditkastenschein, occupation money, that had no backing whatsoever. French shopkeepers accepted them because German soldiers had guns. By 1943, the entire continent had been reorganized into a single pyramid scheme, with Berlin at the apex. At the base were millions of slave laborers, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, French, Belgians, paid nothing and fed just enough to work. Above them were the occupied economies forced to subsidize their own occupation. Above them were the German civilian population, increasingly hungry but still propagandized into believing the struggle was noble. And at the very top sat the Wehrmacht and the SS, consuming everything. Each victory bought time. Norway in 1940 extended the nickel supply. The Balkans in 1941 delivered copper and chromium. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was sold to the generals as the final solution to the raw material crisis. Ukraine's grain, Caucasus oil, Donbass coal would make Germany self-sufficient forever. Instead, the front swallowed divisions faster than factories could replace them. Every mile the panzers advanced cost more fuel than the army could capture. Every town taken required garrisons that drained manpower from production lines. By the winter of 1944-45, the arithmetic was merciless. The Reich was producing more tanks and aircraft than ever before, yet the front was collapsing. Synthetic fuel plants were bombed flat. Railways were in ruins. Slave laborers were dying faster than new ones could be kidnapped. The plunder economy had reached its natural limit. There were no more countries left to rob within marching distance. Every victory had bought more time. Every defeat brought the end closer. In the spring of 1945, the illusion finally died where it had been born. In the vaults of the Reichsbank on Jägerstrasse in Berlin. Soviet artillery was already pounding the city center when the last officials opened the steel doors. Inside lay not gold, not foreign currency, not even the neatly stacked Mefo bills that had once promised everything. There were only a few sacks of worn Reichsmarks, some crates of worthless occupation scrip, and a handful of gold teeth pried from the mouths of the dead. The greatest war machine Europe had ever seen had been financed with smoke, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. The collapse was total and instantaneous. The moment the Wehrmacht stopped advancing, the entire economic structure imploded. Factories that had run 3 shifts a day for 12 years suddenly had no coal, no ore, no oil, no workers. The Reichswerke Hermann Göring, once the largest industrial concern on the continent, became a rusting graveyard overnight. Slave laborers walked out of the gates and simply kept walking. German women who had riveted Messerschmitt wings in 1944 were now scavenging the rubble for potato peelings. The printing presses that had roared for 12 years fell silent. The paper they had produced was now used to plug broken windows. In the end, the bills came due all at once. The 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo paper, the 21 billion in hidden debt, the hundreds of billions extorted from occupied Europe, none of it had ever been real money, only deferred reality. When there were no more countries to rob, the deferral ended. Hyperinflation returned with a vengeance worse than 1923, because this time there was nothing left to burn. A loaf of bread cost billions again, and then trillions. Cigarettes became currency. A single egg could buy a grand piano. The middle class that had once cheered the return of full employment now watched their final savings turn to ash for the 3rd time in one lifetime. The men who had built the machine met their own reckonings. Hjalmar Schacht, the original magician, spent the last year of the war under house arrest in a Bavarian castle, then in Ravensbrück, and finally Dachau, arrested not for building the illusion, but for finally trying to stop it after the 20th of July 1944 bomb plot. At Nuremberg, he was acquitted of war crimes, but the judge's eyes said what their verdict did not. He had made the whole thing possible. He lived until 1970, a ghost in a 3-piece suit, writing memoirs no one wanted to read. Göring, who had taken the system to its logical extreme, swallowed cyanide in his cell rather than hang. The Reichswerke he had boasted would last 1,000 years was dismantled by Allied demolition teams before the war was even 6 months over. The industrialists fared better. Krup's directors served light sentences or none at all. IG Farben was broken into pieces that quietly reassembled as Bayer, Hoechst, and BASF, profitable again within a decade. The men who had accepted phantom money for tanks and poison gas walked free because the world needed their factories to rebuild what those same tanks and gas had destroyed. The German people paid the real price. 8 million dead, cities reduced to 70% rubble in some places. 12 million ethnic Germans expelled from the East with whatever they could carry. The country split in half, occupied, re-educated, and forced to confront the truth that the miracle of the 1930s had been the longest suicide note in history. And the deepest irony of all, the army that had been built with smoke proved in the end to be made of smoke. The Wehrmacht in 1944–45 was numerically larger and technically more sophisticated than in 1941. It produced more tanks in 1944 than in any previous year. Yet it collapsed in months, not because the soldiers suddenly forgot how to fight, but because there was no longer any fuel, ammunition, or food behind the front. The tanks sat immobile for lack of petrol. The aircraft were grounded for lack of avgas. The soldiers walked barefoot because the leather had run out. The greatest military machine ever financed by illusion proved incapable of surviving contact with reality. Germany did not lose the war because it lacked soldiers or weapons. It lost because it had spent 12 years spending money it never possessed, building weapons it could never supply, and conquering territories it could never digest. The moment the expansion stopped, the entire edifice fell inward like a house of cards made of debt. In the end, the arithmetic won. It always does. Germany didn't build an army from wealth, it built one from illusion. When a nation runs out of money, it begins to spend lives. Economic lies can build armies, but they cannot keep them alive. War becomes inevitable when reality becomes unaffordable. The printing presses are silent now. The factories are gone. The gold is gone. The people who believed are gone. All that remains is the warning, written in the rubble of a continent. Never again trust a miracle that has no balance sheet. Germany didn't rise through strength, it rose through illusion. And when the illusion ended, it took everything with it.